Professor, welcome to the third edition of UNDP podcast. I am pleased to meet you here. Welcome to Azerbaijan. You visited Baku to deliver a lecture in the frames of the CAP Talks, which is a discussion and development platform for top thinkers and academicians globally. And we know that the Kapuscinski Development Lectures is a joint initiative of the United Nations Development Programme and the European Commission. And as UNDP, we were extremely happy to host this big event, which is very popular in the academic and scientific circles. So with all this in mind, I would like to pose a few questions for better understanding of our podcast listeners, the idea of planetary health, the area of your expertise. And so thanks once again for your valuable presentation. I think that was highly impressed and by the audience, and especially it was a great experience for young talents, especially for the students of the Azerbaijan Medical University, which was an official partner of the CAP Talks here in Baku. And in my turn, it was my pleasure to moderate such a lecture that allowed me digging into the depth of the field. Thank you once again. So let me start with the first question. Planetary health. That's something new for years. Could you please talk about that as it is?
Well, first of all, it's such a pleasure to be here. I really enjoyed delivering the CAP lecture and a very engaged audience with fantastic questions as well. Planetary health has been around almost 10 years now. Basically, what it is a multidisciplinary international systems approach to addressing the challenges we face today as a result of the Anthropocene, our behaviors, and how we need a healthy planet for human civilization to thrive, and that we are very dependent on a healthy planet for humanity. So what it does address is that we need to look at issues particularly on the planet and health as social, as economic, as behavioral, as environment, as political, as social justice, because you cannot achieve health for humanity without us being able to look at the health of the planet. I think that in today's world, we are facing a lot of complexities. We know that climate change is here. We are exceeding 1.5 degrees. We have other additional problems of biodiversity loss. We have pollution. We have microplastics proliferation. All this is actually contributing to greater challenges for the health of not just humans, but also wildlife. We need to do something urgently.
Thank you, Professor. We know that you are the Executive Director of the Sunway Centre for Planetary Health at the Sunway University, Malaysia. Could you please talk about the background of this initiative?
Sure. Well, I'm a medical doctor by training, and my realization came in my 25 years in the humanitarian sector, where I would be responding to crisis after crisis, particularly climate crisis, and you realize that it's getting worse, but also the impact on people is tremendous now. I was very struck by instances where women and young people were markedly affected. And we can't go on responding. We have to look at underlying drivers. We need to look at systems. How do we actually address the challenges to people and to their health as well? The COVID pandemic was another turning point because it wasn't just out of the blue. It was because of environmental destruction, loss of habitat for a lot of our wildlife, zoonotic leaks happening, and therefore you had a pandemic. And right now, with the additional burden of climate change, biodiversity loss, it's likely that we will have more and more infectious disease outbreaks, perhaps leading to pandemics in a more frequent way. And the pattern of disease is changing. So this is why, when I established the Sunway Centre for Planetary Health, it's within a university which is very, very committed, Sunway University, to sustainability. Planetary Health offers us an opportunity now to look at it through a systems approach. Our centre is a little bit of what I call a think and do tank. So we have the research component with other schools in the university. We have an educational component, but we also have a component of influence. How do you communicate planetary health and science and climate? How do you influence policy, and how do you influence programs? So the center is barely 3 years old, but it has been very active. It was also host to the Planetary Health Summit in April this year, where we had 1,000 plus participants. And we have now developed a roadmap, because there's no point talking about the problems. How do we do it now? How do we solve them? So the whole planetary health movement has come together, developed this roadmap, and talks about steps that we can take for us to be able to try to reverse some of the damage that's already been done.
Thank you, Professor. That's a very good, interesting point. And thank you for the detailed information and as overview. And the topic of your lecture presentation here in Baku, living in a complex world, can planetary health offer a way forward? What does it mean in a broader sense?
Yeah. So I mentioned many times now that it's about systems. It's about re-examining and re-evaluating our own existence as human beings, the choices we make, the way we consume. And all this has an impact on the planet. And therefore, what we develop is a roadmap. So the roadmap, we have 6 areas that we're focusing on. One is looking at an assessment. Where are we today? How are we doing on the planetary health side? What are our policies in place to make sure that our planet is protected, our health is protected? How are we communicating science? Is it in a way that people understand, or does it cause more paralysis? How about education? We need to start very young, for young people to realize that they have to play their role in the way they consume, the way they behave, so that we don't damage the planet further. Now, mind you, young people are not responsible for what's happening today, but also at the higher level. I myself, as a medical doctor, was not trained on climate and health, or pollution and health, or biodiversity loss and health. So now we need to revolutionize education. And then we have this area around business. How do we get the business sector to understand the choices they make? How they do business is really, really important, because they can be a really positive force. In many countries around the world, businesses are driving economies. How do we bring them on board to understand? How do we mainstream, planetary health, so that, whenever we're doing something, we think about our impact of the planet and look at it in a positive way and find positive tipping points and positive solutions. Can we shift to an economy that's different? Ultimately, we have to talk about a just and safe transition. Ultimately, planetary health is also about our planetary boundaries, because there's only a limit to what we can do for us to be able to stay safe. These planetary boundaries have been well described by Johan Rockström, and I think for us to be able to move forward, we have to find a way to reverse some of the transgressions of the planetary boundaries. There are 9, 6 have been crossed. How do we try and reverse them?
I think that's a topic we could talk about for hours even. Yeah. And rural risks, health crises and responses, especially caused by climate change. You repeatedly mentioned this. Could you please provide some details? What's the linkage between planetary health and human crisis and health problems?
Absolutely. I mentioned earlier about planetary degradation and greater increased risk of zoonotic diseases and infectious diseases and so forth. But there's also, I mentioned the planetary boundaries, and these include, our water and our land use, climate change, CO2 emissions, looking at nitrogen, phosphorus in the ground, because of massive agriculture, ocean acidification, novel entities, the stratosphere and so forth. So I think that if we start crossing these planetary boundaries, there will be not only impact on, for example, weather changes, disasters that will happen, which are more frequent and more severe, but also direct impact on people's health. For example, we have been experiencing heat waves, and heat waves have a direct impact on people's health. It can cause even heat strokes and death in some instances, particularly in people who are older, people who are working outdoors. We're talking about migrants, laborers, farmers, fishermen, and also young people. Now, the other issue, of course, is that with global warming, you're seeing disease patterns change. We're seeing now tropical diseases in temperate countries. We're seeing tropical diseases getting worse in tropical countries. And then we're seeing waterborne diseases and other issues as a result, say flooding and so forth. And then there's also, not to forget, the direct impact of heat waves as well as pollution on respiratory disease, on non-communicable diseases. Air pollution now has even been linked to Alzheimer's. And then, plastics is in the middle of it, this triple planetary crisis. We know microplastics is a big issue now. It's found in almost every tissue that we find. It's found in the water we drink. It's found in the air. So all this will cause neuroendocrine disruption and therefore more neuroendocrine diseases, cancers, and so forth. So everything ultimately is linked to our health. So even if we are not somebody, you're a climate denier, surely you also want good health. I mean, ultimately, if we don't have health, we can't work, we cannot interact, and everything's at a standstill. So Planetary Health tells us and reminds us that whatever we do to the planet, it will come back to us and affect our health.
Essentially. And as a continuation of this question, frankly speaking, I wonder, what do you think about the steps to be taken in order to tackle these problems? I mean, how can we formulate this? Why it's so important today?
I think first of all, we have to recognize and acknowledge that the link between our planetary degradation and health is so important. The most critical and most difficult is good politics and good governance. We need to have not only political leadership and will, but also good policies that will incentivize good behavior, protect people, and also disincentivize businesses or activities that will damage the planet. I mentioned earlier about education, communications, the role of business, but ultimately it's also about us. We have to ask ourselves, do we need to buy another device? Do we really need to consume so much? Can we cut down our meat intake because this is causing a lot of emissions? Have we thought about the way we use and consume plastics? All these things, our decisions, our value systems. What is our role on this planet and how do we interact with each other?
Yeah, exactly. And the conflicts, food insecurity and displacement, that all create fertile ground for where infectious diseases spread more easily, weakening the people's immune system even further. And what's the next? How to tackle all of this?
Well, first of all, just to come back to displacement and conflict, we know that as a result of climate change, we know that the sea level is rising, we know that there's desertification, droughts. There is an estimated 1 billion plus people who will be displaced by 2050, will be on the move. We have to think about that future where 1 billion people will be moving to other places. Will they be protected? Will they have access to services and health? So these are complex issues. The other thing you mentioned is food security. Because of water scarcity, because of drought, because of desertification, because of floods, because of climate change, food will also be more insecure. So we need to think about how do we now produce food for communities? What are the alternatives to meat, for example, for proteins? And then conflict. A lot of conflict arises also related to climate change. If you look
especially in light of recent
absolutely,
yeah.
If you look at humanitarian hotspots and you look at climate change areas and you overlay them, they're actually very similar. So sometimes you get a double whammy. You have a conflict and you also have a climate impact. Now, conflict itself is an emitter. We know that the emissions from conflict, from war, is greater than the aviation and marine industry. It's about 5 to 6%. Health sector emits 5%. Wars are great emitters. We need peace. Without peace, you cannot protect the planet and you cannot protect people beyond just injury. So, ultimately, this requires us to rethink. The governance that we have today is the global governance that we're facing is very complex. We are living in a very polarized world. I talked about the uncertainty complex. One, the dangerous planetary changes of the Anthropocene. Two, widespread societal transformations. And third is actually more polarization in the world. So all this is like a storm in a teacup. Everything is happening at the same time, and for us to unravel this requires political will and good governance.
Yeah, exactly. An additional question regarding this topic. What do you think, is there any lesson learned from the pandemic?
When we had the pandemic, we could work differently. We could use our time working remotely. We could be efficient working remotely and so forth. I think we have forgotten. And you look at behaviors today, the consumption patterns have gone up, the use of fossil fuels have gone up, the people are flying everywhere. There's no more appetite for us to have hybrid meetings or virtual meetings. And I think it goes against everything we're trying to do. Even myself, to come to one place, I have to make sure that it's worth for me to come. That means I have to have additional meetings and so forth, because I have to think about, here I'm talking about planetary health, my impact on the planet as well, and how do I compensate for that. Now, I think that we said that life would be different after the pandemic, but we very quickly went back to our habits. And I think this goes back to what I was saying, that we as human beings need to re-examine, our behaviors and how do we change. And I cannot, omit this fact that until and unless we put the elephant in the room, the fossil fuel industry, that is also causing a lot of disease, pollution, and unhealthy toxins in the air, plastics, and so forth. These are all going to affect our health. So that just and rapid transition needs to happen.
Exactly. Thank you. Regarding the pandemic, really, it seems nothing happened 2 or 3 years ago.
Yes.
It's very, difficult to realize for today's activities, for today's daily routine for us, all of us, I mean. And we know that humanitarian systems also face added pressure and responsibility. And where's the happy medium for us? In terms of happy medium, how to align all those steps in order to find the happy medium for all of us?
I think that number one, as I mentioned, is governance, and what are the incentives you put in place and disincentives. So this requires, a strong leadership. But this is very difficult to predict in this world today, right? But let me give you some positive, some hope. If you look at, for example, countries like Costa Rica, they have decided to demilitarize. They invested a lot in the environment. Their people are happy. Their ecotourism is very high. They have carbon, they're really investing in protecting the carbon sink in Costa Rica. How do we make sure that countries like mine, Malaysia, which still have a lot of biodiversity, we move towards that, making sure that those countries with enough biodiversity protect it, right? While we try to reforest. There are many places in the world, for example, Portugal had, a week, I think, where they only ran on renewable energy to prove that it is possible to have this transition. So there are many good examples of countries taking positive steps. My country is developing a national planetary health action plan to look at how does the government and the other stakeholders work and function and work with each other to break the silos so that, we can move towards a healthier population and a healthier planet. Ultimately, if we want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, the foundation is the planetary boundaries. If you keep crossing your planetary boundaries, you will not be able to, achieve sustainability. So I think we have to now tell each other stories of hope. We need to find good stories and good examples where things have moved forward and that we can then learn from that and have a positive outlook. Mental health issues are very serious, among young people. Just reading today, about 50% of young people feel that they are under mental stress and they're not happy. They don't think there's a future because of the environmental damage. How do we now reverse that? How do we give them courage and hope? Large nations like China, electrification is now moving very, very fast. So I think, if they can do it, we can all try to aspire to do that. So I think we need to have hope. We need to tell each other positive narratives, not to be, naive, recognize where the challenges and the problems are. But my biggest fear is that when everyone thinks it's too big a problem, no one wants to do anything about it. We have to do something. And it can be not just at government level, it can be at local level, it can be at individual level as well.
So, Professor, thank you so much for the detailed responses. Much appreciated. And actually, that's what we call the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah.
And another question is about the direct relation of SDGs to the planetary health.
That's right.
How does it work?
Well, I just mentioned, in fact, there's a very good paper that just came out. The Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, but you have to look at the underlying drivers and systems that can make sure that we achieve those goals. If you use the planetary boundaries as that foundation and make sure that you don't cross those boundaries, then you'll be able to move the Sustainable Development Goals 6, 13, 14, 15, all directly linked to the planetary boundaries itself. So I think that ultimately what we have to know is this: nothing works in silos, everything is connected. But most importantly, we are, as humans, as businesses, as economies, connected to nature, and we need to protect it.
Thank you so much once again. And our last question that is going to be traditional for our editions, the planetary health in the context of COP29 preparations. And please talk about your expectations from COP29 to be held later this year in Baku. And what do you think about the main challenge for us as the host country?
Okay, you want me to talk to the camera, is it?
Sure.
I want to wish Azerbaijan all the very best for COP29. It's going to be tough. I know that the focus will be on climate finance. I think this is critical, but what I also want to encourage is to look at climate change and health, because there are resolutions already supporting this. This is now firmly on the agenda, and ultimately human health is where we can begin from to have that conversation about why it's so important to look at finance, to look at air pollution, to look at climate change. And last but not least, my wish from COP29 is really putting very firmly the need for us to transition from fossil fuels, because it's critical for our health.
Professor, good to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us today, and looking forward to seeing you again here in Baku.
I hope so, inshallah. Thank you.